link to a page which contains a huge list of all the relevant HTML entities. All right. Now, of course, for now, that doesn't look great. So let's fix a couple of things, starting actually with the spacing, maybe. So how can we add spacing here? I mean, this element here, all of this is a container and a row, or actually a grid. So just as we saw before, but let's go back there. So we have container, grid, and grid 3 columns. And so to now add some margin here to the bottom, we would have to create another class for that margin, right? So we don't want to add any margin to any of these reusable classes here, right? Because we want them to be basically as neutral as possible. So we could add another helper class here. So a little bit like we did before. And actually, let's do that. So we did that here with one of the buttons. Yeah. So here the margin right small, because we had the same situation where we didn't want to add any margin to any of these button classes here. Again, because they should be reusable, right? So let's now do another helper class, which I'm going to call margin bottom, and let's call it MD for medium. And here I'm going to use 4.8 rem. And again, using the important keywords so that it really will apply. And so now if we add this class here, so yeah, so to this grid and this container here, then that will add that margin. Okay, and here it is, right? So hopefully that made sense and you understood why we did create that new special class here, right? Now we could have done it in another way also. For example, simply adding a margin top to all recipes right here, right? So that would also have been possible, but I liked to use the reusable way. So let's create the all recipes here, and let's center the text. And let's also give it a font size of, again, 1.8 rem. And I'm putting the font size here and not on the link. And I'm doing that for the same reasons as before. So that maybe I will want to reuse this link on other places in the page. And then I don't want to have it always with a font size of 1.8 rem. So somewhere else, maybe a better font size for a link will be 1.4 rem. And so then if we had this fixed size, we could not do that. And so by setting the font size here, then the link, so the anchor element, will simply inherit that size. And here it is, right? And now, of course, we need to style this to adapt it to the rest of the visual style of our page. And so let's do that right here. So after this button, maybe. So link, well, that should be first link, and then the visited pseudoclass. And here the first thing that I want to do is to give it a brand orange color. Then I want to remove the text decoration, set it to none. But then I actually want to recreate something similar. So let's just see what we have right now. And so, of course, now there is no underlining, but usually links do have some underline, right? However, usually we do not use text decoration for that, but recreate it using a border, because, as I will show you, that looks a lot nicer. So let's do that. So border bottom, 1 pixel, solid, and then the color of the border. And now here, let me show you yet another trick. So instead of writing the exact same color as we have here, which is the color that we want, so instead of doing this, we can do something else, which is to write the current color keyword. And so what this will do is that it will take the color that is currently the text color. Okay? And so then we don't have to repeat the same color. And that is especially helpful if for some reason we change the color, for example, on a hover state. Okay? So for now, it doesn't look so good yet. So that's okay. But what usually we do when we design a link is to then give it some padding at the bottom. So padding bottom and then something really small like 2 pixels. And if we want to use padding, we also need to set this to an inline block. Right. And so let's check that out. Now that looks kind of the same. So let's inspect that here. Well, that actually makes a difference. So these 2 pixels that we have here, and if we had the text decoration, it would be right here. So that does not look ideal. And so this is why everyone does it like this. So we remove the text decoration and then do it in this way. All right. And now as for the hover and active states, which, as you see, we usually always group together, but we wouldn't have to, of course. They could be different, and we did that in the very first project, but again, it's very common to see them being together. Okay, so here let's change the color simply to the darker color, which is this one. Okay, and then as we hover over it, watch how the border also changes to the same color, right? And so that's because we used the current color trick, so that keyword. And so now, yeah, it always automatically has the exact same color as the text, right? However, in this case, we actually don't want the underline anymore. So that's another common style that is common to use on links. So when we hover them, we remove the border at the bottom, right? However, we cannot just say border bottom none, for example, and let me show you why. So you see that the entire layout jumps a little bit by 1 pixel, right? And so that is because that 1 pixel is actually part of the element. And so when we remove that on hover, then the element becomes smaller, and then, well, that messes up the spacing of the entire page. And in this case, it is just 1 pixel, but still, it will create a noticeable effect, as you can see here, or maybe you can experiment it on your own computer. And so instead, what we do is to keep it at 1 pixel still, solid, but instead of giving it a real color, we use the transparent keyword. Okay, and so here you just learned another important keyword for colors. And so that will now fix that problem. Okay, now just to finish, let's make this animate here as well. And so on the normal state, we use the transition property with all and set it to, let's again use 0.3 seconds. Okay, so that looks very nice. And so now let's analyze our entire section here. So I think it looks really, really good, like professionally designed, but we can still improve just a small detail here. So right now, due to the fact that we have this link here centered, we can see some imbalance here. So all of this looks a bit centered here as well, and then also the link, but then we have this here aligned to the left side, right? So it's aligned to the left, just like here as well. And so to make this one a bit different from the first one, and also to add some balance to this section, we can also center all of this. And as you will see, this will then create a really nice effect. So making it a little bit different than the other section. All right. So to center that text, we have to come here to where it is defined. So that's right here. Now, how can we actually center this text here? So of course, we do not want to add text align center on these two, right? And once again, that is because these are supposed to be reusable. So instead, we can simply center, so we can simply set the text align center property on the container here, right? And so that's exactly what I will do. And I will create another helper class here. So let me actually write that here. So helper classes, or we can also call them like settings classes. So these are small helper classes that have just one declaration. So I'm calling this one here, let's call it center text, and then text align center. And so now I can simply add that here. So center text, and then these two elements will actually inherit that, right? We could also put it directly here and here. Well, here actually I think it would not work because this is an inline element unless we change that. Let's see if we actually did. Oh yeah, we set it to a block. So we could actually also set center text here, but well, it's simpler to simply put it here and then have these two elements inherit it. Okay, and so once again, we created this helper class here for the sake of reusability. So to make these two reusable instead of having that right there. Okay, and so now this entire section here looks like it is really centered on the page. Okay, and so with this, we could now say that we finished this section, but I just want to show you one more thing. So I want to add a nice hover effect here on these two cards. So that's something that we would not have to do, but yeah, I want to show you more and more things here. So let me just quickly show you how we can do that in just one line of CSS. So that's something that I think we have never done before, which is to use hover on something that is not a link. But we can, of course, perfectly do that. So we have meal, which is the entire card, and then we can use the hover pseudo class on that one. So the effect that I want to implement here is that whenever we hover over this element, I want the entire element to move up a little bit. All right. So again, I'm sure you have seen this in action somewhere on the web. And so for this, so for moving up, I like to use the transform property with the translate value. So we have used translate before, remember that, a couple of times. And so here we have to define two values where the first one is for horizontal movement and the second one is for a vertical movement. So for example, we can say to rem here, right? So again, horizontal, which is like X, and then the second is vertical, which is Y. So the X and Y axis. So of course, this will not be what we want, but you see that once we hover it, it does happen. So it does move 20 pixels down and to the right. Okay. However, I only want to move it up, so only in the Y direction. And so here actually we can use the translate Y property. And so then we only define the Y property, so the vertical one, right? So that is a bit better already. So just in one direction, but I want it to go up. So that's -2. Okay, but that's also a little bit too much because this effect should be something very subtle. And of course, also there should be an animation, right? So 1.2 rem here, and now the animation. Now, how do you think we can do that animation? Well, once again, that's very simple. All we have to do is to use the transition property on the original state. So that's this one. So transition all, and now let's go a bit higher. So the bigger the element, the longer we can animate it. So let's now use 0.4 seconds this time. Okay, nice. That looks quite nice actually. Great. And now, just as a very final touch, let's also manipulate the shadow here a little bit to make this effect look a bit more realistic. So by moving up the element, we kind of simulate it moving closer to the source of the light, right? And so therefore, the shadow can then become a bit larger. So let's do that. And I will just copy this here. So right here. And so we will make it larger. So let's move one step up here to 3.2 rem and here to 64, so to 6.4 rem. And then we should also make it a bit lighter. So a shadow that is more diffused and bigger, basically, also naturally should be lighter. And again, these things, you will learn them with practice, right? All right. So that's very subtle actually, but if you notice, then the shadow does change a little bit. And this makes it more natural indeed. Okay. And so, yeah, that's it for this section. Once again, very beautiful, very nice looking, I think. And our page is really coming together here. So we have this beautiful section. This one here is very gorgeous as well. And of course, also our header. So I hope you're having a lot of fun here and that you're starting to become really proud of what you're building here. And yeah, once you're ready observing this beautiful project, then let's move together to our next section because there is still a long way to go. Welcome back to our next project section, which is the very exciting testimonials section. And here, remember, we had already decided in the very beginning of the project that we were going to put the customers and the photo gallery side by side. So what we're going to do here is a very different section this time, which is going to go all the way from the left side to the right side of the browser. So not having a centered container, but instead filling up basically the entire available width. And so that is what we call a full bleed section. So again, we will have the gallery on the right side, and on the left side, we will have this 2x2 grid of customer testimonials, just like in this first design example that we have here on the right side. Okay, so this is going to be really exciting because it's going to be quite different from the other sections. And so let's get to work. All right. And as always, let's add a new section right after the previous one. And I'm calling this one, as you can guess, the section testimonials. All right. And now, as I just said before, here we are not going to use a container. So that container element that we created before to center the context in the page. So instead, we will basically have two boxes, one for the testimonials and one for the gallery. So let's do that here. So let's write that just here. And then another one for the gallery. All right. And so these two, we want them to be side by side, right? And so what we can do here is to use our grid class right here on this section, right? So grid and grid to columns. So let's just quickly check that out. And I need to reload the browser here manually. So sometimes that is necessary. And indeed, now here we have the testimonials all the way to the left side and the gallery all the way to the right side. Great. So let's add some padding here to this section for now to give ourselves some more space. And then we will simply start by filling up the content for the testimonials. So I will again copy this. And then section like this. Okay. So let's actually reach into our content file and get the testimonials from there. So yeah, right here. So this is the first one here from Dave Bryson. So let's paste that here. And now we need to mark this up. So we want a customer photo. We then want this text here in another element. And then below that is the name. So Dave Bryson here. And so we need some kind of container element for all of this, right? Now we could of course use a simple div element, but here actually there is another element which makes a bit more sense, which is the figure element. And I'm not sure if we have used the figure element before, but in any way, we can use it to represent some self-contained content, and which sometimes has a caption. So this is perfect for things like diagrams or photos or code listings, or really anything that can have a caption and that is self-contained. And a testimonial like the one we are about to write here, I think qualifies quite nicely for that. So you will see the figure element being used for this kind of thing all the time. Okay. So let's call this one the testimonial. And then, well, first let's start with the image, actually. So image, then it's probably in the customers folder. And there we have actually a named photo for each of them. So this is Dave, and so the photo is probably dave.jpg, right? And now for the actual testimonial content, we can use the block quote element. So block quote, as the name says, is basically for representing quotes. So things that someone else said. And so testimonial is exactly that. And the same is true for something like a product review, or even to quote someone in the context of an article or a blog post, for example. So block quote is perfect in this case. Let's call it the testimonial text. And then put that right there. Here we forgot the class right here. So testimonial image and also the alt text. Let's say photo of customer Dave Bryson. Okay, and now we just need to mark up the name here, and for that we can use a simple paragraph or a span element. So that doesn't really matter. I'm just going to use a paragraph here. So testimonial name, let's say, and then let's add his name right there. And then it's also common to like add a dash in front of the name. So for that, we can use just another HTML entity. And this one is called m dash. So if we hover over that, you see there it is. So instead of just using this, which wouldn't look so great, the M dash is exactly what we're looking for. So checking that out, here we go. So the image is always a bit too big, but this time it's not so bad. So we can actually, I think, start adding the rest of the content here before having to adjust the CSS first. So let's copy all of this and put them all one after another. So we have 4 testimonials, so 4 code blocks here. And the next one is, need to go back. Let's copy all this, and I will immediately paste it actually into this block quote element. And then we just remove the name here. Also here, and then here we go. So let's see. Indeed, now the second one is great. And now let's just replace the third and the fourth one. And so this part of filling up the content is always a bit boring. But well, the content is the most important thing, so we have to do it, of course. So here and here. And just one last time. And just replacing the name here one last time. Okay, great. So let's check that out. And there we go. So now what we want to do next is to put these 4 here into a 2x2 grid, right? So that's easy. So let's do that. And for that, we need to select this testimonials, which is basically the parent of these 4. And so we will make this one here our grid container. Now, you might think that we could use, of course, the reusable grid that we created before. And indeed, we could, but probably the spacing on that one is not ideal. So the gap that we used there, which makes sense for bigger layouts, is probably too big for a smaller component like this one. And so here we simply create our own new grid. So basically that reusable grid that we created is more for the overall page layout. All right. So grid, template columns, 1FR and 1FR. And then let's create some smaller gap. So maybe 4.8 rem. That's always a good value to start with. And let's also make the image immediately a bit smaller. So testimonial image. And now this image, we actually don't want it to be flexible. So let me show you what would happen if we did. So setting a width of 100% would make it probably way too big. Right? So that's not what we're looking for. Indeed, it is nicely fluid like this. But again, yeah, these images here, we want them to be a fixed width. So let's say instead 64 pixels. And since these images are squared, the height will then automatically be figured out by the browser. We also want to make them round. And again, since they are squared already, we can just use border radius 50%. Okay, nice. That's starting to look a lot better. Now, there is no spacing here yet on the side here, but we will fix that a little bit later. So for now, let's just take care here of the visual styling just of this text here. So very quickly, we want the testimonial text and the testimonial name. So here we're going to use our common 1.8 rem again. So this is the one that we have been using all the time for all kinds of contents. And so it's nice to keep it consistent, and the same for the line height as well. So again, using 1.8 rem here, or actually, of course, not rem, just 1.8, because this is basically a multiplier. So this will multiply the font size here by 1.8, and that will then be the line height. Remember that? And then let's also add some margin here to the bottom. And here we will not have a lot of space, so let's keep it small at 16 pixels. And of course, we also need some space below the image. So margin bottom 1.2. So that's the previous step in our spacing system. And then here the name. And here, as for visual hierarchy, this one is a lot less important. So let's make it smaller. Let's say 1.6 rem. And let's also make it even lighter. Now the main text is 555 and the darker text is 333, right? And so let's try for this one here 777. And we will actually change this here in a minute because of the color contrast ratio. But for now, let's go with this. So let's check it out. And beautiful. That looks really cool. Now let's actually just add the section heading here. And that heading, we will actually do it right here inside of the testimonials container. So here before these testimonials, we will have our usual subheading and secondary heading. So let's go back. And we can, again, copy that from the previous section. So just this here. Right here. And so, as I just said before, we want these headings to be basically before these testimonials here. Right? So just like this. But then we don't want them to be centered. And we don't want them to be inside of a container. So actually we don't need any of this here, right? But now we actually do have another problem. And let me illustrate that to you. And so here you can see it. So now remember how we made this entire section a grid container, right? And so now the subheading and the secondary heading here, they simply became grid items as well, right? But that's not what we want. We want them to be basically inside of this left side here of this section. So what we're going to do is to wrap all of this here into another new container element. And with container, I don't mean the container class that we created, but instead, I mean like a parent element. So let's call this the testimonials container, and then let's put the closing tag here after all of this. So right here in the end, but of course before the gallery. Okay. So here we need to, of course, also change the text. So, well, here we actually didn't get any title. So the subheading is quite simple. It's simply going to be testimonials. But then here we need to come up with another heading. And so the one that I decided to use here is kind of a catchy one, saying once you try it, you can't go back, which is basically the overall message that these 4 testimonials here give to the user. Okay, so let's check it out. And now it is fixed. So just to see here in the inspector, now this one here is a grid container, right? And it contains both the testimonials container and the gallery on the other side, right? And then inside of the testimonials, we have then again another grid, which is for these 4 individual testimonial figures here. Okay, great. So that's great progress already. And so now in the next lecture, we will start building the gallery here on the right side. Let's continue building our testimonial section by now adding the gallery. So here we already have the element with the class of gallery. And so this is where now we are going to add our 12 images. And so also the gallery will then of course be our grid container, right? Now here I could of course now simply put all these 12 images one after another, but I actually will want to build a very nice hover effect on these images. And so for that, I will need each of them to be inside of a container element. And for that, I will use again the figure with the class of gallery item. So not gallery, but more like this. And now let's add the image here. So img, and then reach into the gallery folder, and then here gallery 1. And the alt text is, and here I'm actually just going to write a generic alt text instead of describing each of the images perfectly. So I will just write photo of beautifully arranged food, because this is what all these images here are all about. Here, forgetting to close the element. Yeah, that's it. So the figure element is really the perfect container element for images. So many times when you see, for example, in a blog post images, then usually they also have some kind of caption. And for that, we can use the fig caption element and then write something basically below it. Something like this. All right. Now in this case, we actually don't want any caption. We simply want to display the image inside of this container. And again, the reason for that is a really cool hover effect, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So I will turn this off here, just so you know that we can also use the fig caption element inside of the figure element. So we cannot use this one outside. It is only allowed to be used inside of figure. Okay. But anyway, let's copy that here. Let's remove this, and now just gallery 2. And you see here, it is now a different image. And yeah, so just an image inside of a figure. And so now let's just copy this a couple of times. So not even counting here. If it's too much, we just delete the remaining ones. So 3, 4, 6. So we're halfway through because it's 12 images. 8, 9, 10, and we're just missing 1. Pasting that here again, and number 12. And there we go. So that's the HTML of our gallery. Very simple. But here, of course, it is going to look crazy. And it does. So, of course, we need to make them a lot smaller. And notice these small space here between the images. That is actually because the images are inline elements by default. And so if we made them a block element, then this would disappear. And this is something important that you need to know, because sometimes we get these annoying white spaces around images, and then this is how you fix that. So gallery item, and then I didn't add a class here to these images, so I'm simply using the descendant selector here. And so to fix that space, all we have to do is to set them to a block level element. And so now you see that the spacing is gone. Okay. But now, of course, what we will want to do is to actually create our grid. So that's right here on the gallery element. So gallery, and once again, here we are creating like our own new grid instead of using the predefined one. So display grid, and then grid template columns. And we want 3 equal sized columns. So 3 times 1 FR. All right, but still that will not fix the problem, because now the images are still huge and they no longer even fit our page. All right, and so of course the solution here is to make these images here flexible. So simply giving them a width of 100%. And so that should fix it, and it did. Nice. That's starting to look like something already. Let's just add some small spacing between the images, so not to have them glued together like that. And a very small gap here should be enough, like just 16 pixels. Something like this. And then let's go back, and that looks beautiful. Okay, so the gallery itself is actually already done, right? And so let's think now about this entire section, because there is still a lot of stuff that we need to fix here. So first of all, to make this section here stand out a little bit more, especially because we have these two content blocks here side by side, we should now give this section here a different background color. So you see that we have these 3 sections which all have the white background color, and the first one here, so the hero, has this very light orange tone. And so I think we should now finally go back to having a section with that orange tone as well, to make it stand out a little bit more from the rest, and to create some nice visual contrast here between the sections. So let's do that. And I think it is this one here. Right. So that looks already a lot nicer, I think, at least. But now there's still something strange going on, because it would be a lot nicer if the spacing, for example, here at the top would be exactly the same as is here between these images. And also here at the right side. So the gallery is glued right now here to the side of the browser, and it would be nice to basically also have the exact same spacing that is here inside of the gallery around it. So that would make it look a bit more natural. And so what we need to do is to basically remove this huge padding from the section and instead put it inside of this container right here. So having this big padding only inside of this left side. Okay. So I'm going to remove that from here and put it in the testimonials. And actually we will want it basically around the entire thing. So not just top and bottom, because with this, we will then finally also create some space around it. And actually that was the wrong element. So let's go back. Ah, yeah. So it should, of course, be here in the testimonials container. So not just around the grid container, but really inside this entire thing. So including the headings, right? And yeah, so that is what I was going for. So with this, we have the exact same spacing here as we had in the other sections and also below it. And also we have the same spacing here on the left side. So that looks perfect like this. But now let's think about the spacing that I was talking about earlier. So basically adding this spacing around the gallery that is also inside of it. So that shouldn't be too hard. We can simply add some padding also inside the gallery. So padding 1.6 rem, and so again the exact same spacing as we have here, right? And that is exactly what I was talking about. So that looks really cool, I think, and it's nicely integrated now basically into this section. Now we just have some problems here, I would say, for example, that here the text is quite narrow and it is breaking here into these 5 lines in this one and in this one, while here at the top we only have 4 lines. So all in all, it is looking a bit narrow, and I think even the spacing between these two is not enough. So the spacing here, I think, between the rows is good, but it's many times the case that for the columns we need some more spacing. So let's actually increase that before we do the other thing that I was talking about. So the row gap is good already. But now let's add a lot more column gap. So many times it doesn't look so natural to have the same gap in the row and in the column. And so the column many times needs a lot more. So that looks a lot better in terms of spacing, but then we made the problem even worse of the content here being too narrow. So there are 2 things that we need to fix here. First of all, there is too much space between the gallery and the testimonials here. And let me show you that in the inspector. So the inspector, once again, is really an invaluable tool here. So what I mean here is that, of course, around the testimonials container, we have our padding of 9.6, right? And so that's basically the space that we would want between these testimonials and the gallery. However, here inside this grid, we also have this spacing, right? And so this space we actually do not want here. So instead of using this predefined grid here, so our big layout grid, we will actually once again create our own grid. So for this reason that we can remove then the gap here, but there's also a second reason which I will talk about next. So that is the second thing that I mentioned earlier. So I said the first thing is that the spacing here is too much, which is because we're adding the padding plus the column gap. But then the second problem is that I think that actually this gallery here is a bit too wide. So right now, of course, these columns have the same size, but we should fix that. Okay, but first, let's do that first thing. So removing this predefined grid from here and creating our own grid for the section testimonials. So that's here. And so display grid. And then grid template columns. And for now, I will again make them equally sized, just so we can see that first problem being fixed. Okay. And so now you see that the only spacing that we have here is basically coming from this padding, and then also that 1.6 rem of padding that is coming here from the gallery. But I would say that we can neglect that one, right? So this is a bit better now, but still we have these two here in 5 lines of text and not just 4, which would make them look a lot better like here. Also, this content here is very dense it's like a big wall of a lot of colorful and big content. And so if you take a look at this, it kind of looks as though this right side here would be a lot bigger than the left side, right? It has a huge visual impact, and so I think we can fix that a little bit simply by making this gallery a little bit more narrow. And so that will then, of course, free up some space here for this left side, and will also visually make it look a lot more balanced. Okay. Now, here, of course, we don't want to make huge changes. So, for example, we don't want this column to be twice as wide as the other one. That would be way too much, right? So, like this, it also doesn't look good. So one trick that I like to use when I'm using FRs here is to use them as though they were percentages. So remember that these two values here, they actually don't need to be 1 in order for the columns to have the same size. They simply need to be the same number. So we could also say 50 and 50, right? So that would then look exactly the same as before. And so now this looks a little bit like percentages, where this one is like 50% and this one is another 50%. Just remember that we do not use percentages here because then we wouldn't take care of the gap. Now here we don't have a gap, but anyway, we always should use FR. Now the point of this is that now we can say that this one should be like 55% and this one just 45. And so with this, we still have 100, and so the width is the same as before, but it is now going to be a bit more balanced. So you see that? So this is, I think, a lot better. And again, of course, these two together do not need to be 100. We just do it like this, so we can think of this in terms of percentages. So that's just a nice trick that I like to use myself. Okay? Now, if we check this out, this will create a problem. Well, actually not right now, but let's see that we make this a bit smaller. Then we would get all this weird spacing here between these rows, right? And we do not want that, of course. And so here in our grid, let's define align items set to center. And so that will, or at least it should, fix that problem. Right? Now, of course, the spacing here is gone, like that uniform spacing that we had with this 1.6 rem at the top as well. And so this is not ideal, but we will fix this a little bit later with media queries. Okay, for now, on this screen size here at least, I think it looks really, really nice. Now, just a small detail that I mentioned before is the color of this text here. So remember that it is 777 on now this background color. And so the contrast ratio might not be great at this point. So let's actually check that here in the contrast checker. And so, yeah, well, we're actually using this one, but still it is poor. So it should be above 4.5. And so what I'm going to do now is to basically drag this here as low as it can before it becomes yellow, basically, right? So yellow means that it is at least 4.5, which means it is acceptable. So this gray color here is basically the last one that we can use safely on this background color. So let me copy it and use this one instead. Okay. So VS Code then converted it to the lowercase f's. And let me actually paste then this color here in our design decisions. And I'm going to say lightest gray allowed on this one. All right. So let's go back. And yeah, nice. So it looks almost the same as before, but it is still significantly lighter than this one, creating this nice visual hierarchy between this more important content and then this one. All right, and with this, we are almost finished with this section. So we could actually say we are finished, but remember how I said that I wanted to show you a nice hover effect here on these images. And so let me now show you what I'm talking about. So basically what I want to do is that whenever we hover over one of these images, that they'll scale up so that they become a little bit larger. So that's quite simple. So we will again select these images, and then we will define the hover state on the images. So basically what happens as we hover over the images. So here again we use the transform property, which remember has all kinds of different options. So we have used all the time the translates functions here, but there are other things that we can do. For example, we could rotate them. So let's try that, like 45 degrees. So DEG stands for degrees, and so that's yet another unit that we can use in CSS. So of course this is not what we're going for, but we could do this. So now the images rotate. And sometimes if you're building something like a more creative layout, then this might actually be a nice effect to go for. But in this case, what I want to do is really to scale. And I think we already did this before at some point. Let's try 1.1. Okay, like this. But now, of course, let's make it smooth. And so remember that all we have to do in order to do that is to add the transition property on the original element. So transition all, so which I'm always using, because then if later I add some other things here to the hover effect, then I can be sure that it is covered here in the transition property already. And let's again use our longer animation time, so the same time that we used also in the cards. And this could actually be another design decision that we could put here in general, so animation times. But well, let's not overcomplicate things. And so now the animation is nice and smooth, but still there is something missing, because, well, it works perfectly, but it doesn't look really, really nice like this. So I think it does look a bit weird and a bit off. And so now that's where this container element comes into place. So the element into which we wrapped each of the images. So remember that down here, each of the images is inside of a figure, right? And so now as we scale up the images, they will basically overflow their parent element, right? And we can see that here in the inspector. So if we keep this one selected, well, cannot really see that, but if we turn on the grid, then it should become visible. And yeah, so basically each of these squares here is one of the figure elements. And so now as we hover, the image actually overflows that figure, right? And so what we can do to prevent that, remember, is to simply set overflow to hidden. And so that is the missing part of this trick and of this cool effect. So gallery item, overflow, hidden. And let's remove this, or actually don't yet. And so you see that now it does no longer overflow the figure, because we fixed that with, once again, overflow hidden, which is a really important property that we need all the time. All right, and so now the images look as though they were the exact same size as before, but they scale in a little bit, so they kind of look as though they move towards the user as we hover them. And so this is something that I really like, and it is just another cool trick that we can do using the power of CSS. Nice. So very, very beautiful section here, I think. And I'm pretty sure that you also really like it. So that's just putting all the design guidelines that we used before into practice together with the power of CSS to achieve it. So we're getting closer to the end of our OmniFood project, but there's still 3 sections to go. And so this next one will be the section on pricing and features. So remember how we had already decided that we're going to join together the pricing and also the features of the OmniFood product into one single section. And so this is the one we will build over the next few lectures. So in our content file, we had 2 pricing plans, and so we will create these 2 pricing tables just like in this example on the right side. So with the name of the plan at the top, so with this really big font size there, and then after that, just a list of the features that are included in that pricing plan, and then finally also a call to action button below it. Okay, so 2 pricing tables side by side, and then after that, we will have the typical 4 columns with the other features that are also included in OmniFood. So here we will have some icon that I will want to enclose in like a colored shape. So just like here in this other design example, and then below that a small text and the description. We're going to start in this lecture and probably the next one with the pricing tables, and then in the end we will also build these features. So let's now go have some fun with that. And as always, adding a new section here with the class of section pricing. And as the very first thing, we will want our typical heading here. So here in the testimonials, it is not the way we want, because remember that this section is quite different from the other ones. So instead what we want is this entire container which will center the content in the viewport. So all of this here. So let's paste that here very quick. But we still need to get rid of this center text because here we do not want to center these headings. So this one is pricing. And let's see if we have some title here for the pricing plans. So maybe somewhere up here. Well, where is the pricing actually? Ah, here it is. So here it just says we have 2 pricing plans, but that doesn't really sound so convincing. So of course we want users to sign up for one of these plans, and so we should have a pretty convincing headline here. So I'm going to write a headline that basically tells users that OmniFood allows them to eat well while still being cheap. Or, well, not cheap, but not so expensive. So we can say eating well without breaking the bank. Okay. And so these kinds of titles, of course, you ideally want to get them from your client. But if you don't, then you will just have to basically write them on your own. But then don't forget to also charge them something extra for doing that. Okay, of course you don't have to, but I would at least try that. So as always, let's copy this first part here. So section pricing, and let's give it, as always, the same padding here. And then let's already go check it out. And there it is. Nice. So let's now add another container, which we will make our grid container, so that in there we can have both our pricing tables side by side. So I'm going to create a new container. And here, this one, I will also make it a grid and a grid of 2 columns. So grid, 2 cols. Okay, so let's call each of them a pricing plan. And then let's just duplicate this here. So plan 1 and plan 2. And then let's see if they are already nicely side by side. And of course they are, thanks to our reusable grid. Okay, and now let's start filling each of them up. So let's get our content here. So we have this sentence here that we could probably place after these pricing plans. And then here we have the plans themselves. So let's just get the first one here. So let's place that somewhere down here. And okay, so we want to start with the name of the plan, remember? And so let's call that one the plain name. Plan name. So this one is the starter. Next up, we have the price. So let's use another paragraph here, but we could just as well also use a span element. So plan price. So this one is $3.99 per month. However, here I actually don't want to write the per month immediately after this, and instead I will want to put it in a new line, as I will show you soon. However, remember how just the number itself of the price, so just this value here, was really big in that example I showed you in the beginning. And so here I want to do the same thing. And so I will just wrap this $sign here into its own span so that we can then format it individually. Okay. Then next is where we will put that per month, but I will actually write a bit more. So let's call this one the plan text. And so here, something nice that I have been seeing is that some companies display their price basically per day. So in this case here, what users get for their $3.99 per month is 1 meal per day, right? And so we can do a quick calculation of dividing $3.99 by 30 days per month. So that's normally the average day in a month. And so we can now say that this is basically just $13 per meal, right? And so that's not too bad. So that sounds good for the user, and so we can write that right here. So per month, just to make it really clear, and then that's just $13 per meal. Right. Then next we have basically here this list of features. Now we already kind of have something like this on our page, right? We already have a list pre-built. So what I mean is this list right here. So this is also, well, in this case, not a list of features, but it is still a list. And so this, I think, would look quite good also in our pricing table. And so what we can do is to now reuse this list. So let's actually go where it is defined, which is right here. So here in the meals section, and there was actually a reason why I didn't call this here immediately the meal list. So everything here was like meal icon, meal attribute, but this one I just called it list. And that is because the list is always a good candidate for reusability. And so that's what we will do now. So I'll just cut the code from here and put it here in our general file, just so we know that it is something reusable. Just here before these helpers. Okay. And so now let's also then simply go ahead and copy the HTML. So just like this. So I'm just copying one li, and then I can just duplicate that a couple of times. So right here after this paragraph, now okay. So this first one is 1 meal per day. So instead of vegetarian, and then I'm just duplicating this twice now, using that shortcut. Then the order times are between 11 and 9. Let's put that here. And finally, delivery is free. So in a way, these are also OmniFood features, but these ones are displayed right in the pricing table because they are really important. So let's see what this looks like. And okay. So at least now the list is already formatted, while the rest of the pricing plan, of course, is not yet, but we will leave that for a little bit later, so that we can now actually create the second one. Or actually, there's still something missing, remember, because I also want to place a call to action button at the very end here. And actually, that call to action button might be exactly the same as in the header. So the one that says start eating well. So let's grab simply this one from here. And so that then will also lead the user to that call to action section that we will build a little bit later. So that should be here right after this UL. And here, of course, we do not need this class. So no margin on the right. And that's it. Let's just check it out again. And yeah, nice. So now let's just duplicate the same thing here for plan number 2. So basically copying all of this. And yeah, then we can just replace this entire thing, getting the content here. Let's just paste it here somewhere. And so this one is called the complete. So that's $649 per month. And here we actually get 2 meals per day. So this here should be meals. And so instead of getting 30 meals per month, we actually get 60 now. So let's see what that is per meal then. So 694 divided by 60, and actually that's 649. So that's about $11 per meal, right? So clearly this one here is cheaper. And so with this, we make it immediately obvious, well, that it is cheaper indeed. So 2 meals per day. When we replace that here, so 2 meals. This one we can order 24/7, so that's also an advantage. Delivery is free as well, so this one is the same, but then there is another one. So let's duplicate this very quick and get access to the latest recipes. Okay, and for some reason it keeps jumping back up. Okay, and now let's add some visual styles here to this text. So let's select these class names. So the pricing plan, let's leave it for later. So that's more of a layout part. And instead, I'm going to copy these 3 right here. So the name, price, and text. And then again, I'm using the Alt or Option trick of selecting everything, then moving here to the back and doing it all at the same time like this. Okay. Now, first of all, we want these 3 here to be centered inside of the plan. So we could now add text align center to all of them, but I think it would be better to actually create like a distinction here in the code between this top part of the pricing plan, so these three here, and then the list afterwards. So I think that also semantically this makes more sense. And so here we can use a header element. So basically saying that these three elements here are the introduction, so they are the header of this component, so of all this content. So let's call this here the plan header and put that here. And then I will do just the same in the other one, of course. Okay. And so now we can also select that and add text align center to that itself. So text align center, and we can then also create some space after it. For example, by saying margin bottom of 48 pixels. Okay. So that's already a start here. And of course, we are still lacking a lot of styling there. So let's keep going. So the plan name, I want it to be a bit similar to the subheadings. So what this means is, let's use this color here. So this a little bit darker version of the orange. We also want to make it a bit bold using 600 here. And let's give it a font size of, well, let's start with 1.8. I want it to be uppercase as well. And let's even give it some letter spacing of 0.75. Okay, then let's think about the price. So remember how here I want to make the text really big. So let's check our list here of big values. So something like 74 or 62, let's try 74. So 7.4 rem, make it bold as well. And also make it darker. So just like all our headings that we usually have, even though this is not a heading, but it will look a little bit similar. Then, as for the plan text, let's start with our typical 1.8 rem font size and line height of also 1.8 here. Okay. So let's check it out. And of course, we still need some spacing. And well, in general, I think the entire text here is a bit too big. So this text here, for example, is more like a supporting text. And so let's make that smaller and also lighter. So this one here is our default text size and also the default text color. So let's make this one smaller and lighter. And the same for these here, actually. So everything is a bit too big for me. And then, of course, we also need to select this one and make it smaller. So again, just like in that design example I showed you in the beginning. So 1.6 here, let's also decrease the line height. And well, right now the line is actually not breaking, so we cannot even see the line height. But later on, when the page becomes smaller, and there's less space, then the line will have probably multiple lines, and then the line height becomes important. So here let's also go to the smaller one, 6.2 rem, and the same here. So we got a little bit carried away here with our font sizes, but like this it should be better. Let's also add some margin to the bottom here. 3.2 rem, let's say, and then also to the price itself. Margin bottom. And here I will use less spacing because I think the price and the text, which kind of describes the price, they belong closer together then the plan name and the price. So here we're once again using the law of proximity. Okay, and then this one here does not need any margin to the bottom because, well, the margin here is already been taken care of up here in the margin bottom of the plan header. Now, just before we go check it out, we should also format that $sign there. So that is in plan price, and then the span element in there. So let's make it smaller, but also not like super small. Let's say like 3 rem. And if we don't want it to be as bold, then we need to also override the font weight that it is now inheriting from this one. Right, so this is a child element of the plan price, and so it is indeed inheriting the font weight. And so let's make it a little bit less so. Let's also add some margin to the right here, so to create some space between the two. And here 8 pixels might be good. So 0.8 rem. So let's check that. And yeah, that looks quite nice. But now I do think that the text here is actually too small, the name of the price here. But now, after all, I do actually think that this text here is way too small. So the name of the price is indeed quite important. So let's make it bigger. So here, like 2 rem, maybe even. Yeah, I think that makes sense like this. And now as for spacing, what we need next is some space between this one and this one. And I also want to center horizontally this button here. So we could now add some more helper classes to this button, but instead I will simply create like a parent element to this one here. So this one, let's call it the plan sign up. Okay. So let's text align center it. And then here we can add some margin to the top. So basically to create some space between the list and this element here. So instead of using a margin bottom on the list, we simply use margin top on the element below that. Because remember, the list is a reusable item, so a reusable component, and so there we do not want any margins. So between the header and the list, there is a margin of 4.8, and so let's use the same here. So margin top here, and now again 4.8 rem. Okay. Oh, and of course we need to do the same thing here on the left side as well. So just copying this. And there we go. Okay, so that is already looking like something. Oh, and I forgot to make this text here lighter. So remember how I said I was going to make it smaller and lighter, but I forgot the lighter part. So color here, and remember how we used to use 777, but remember that on the orange light background, that was not accessible. So here I will again use this one, because we will want to add actually some background color a bit later here. So going back, that looks even better, I think, in terms of visual hierarchy. And yeah, this is starting to look designed, starting to look nice, but there are still a lot of things that we will want to fix here. And so let's actually do that in the next video. So let's quickly continue formatting or pricing tables. And first of all, let's give them here a background color to make them stand out from the rest of the section here. So yeah, we hadn't even selected them yet. So pricing plan. And then the background color of this very light orange here. So basically our very lightest tint. And so, yeah, so we have the color, but of course there are a lot of things to fix. So we need some spacing here, so some padding, and let's also make the borders round. So using the same border radius as we used up here. So I believe that was 11 pixels. So border radius 11 pixels, and adding a nice big padding of 4.8 rem. So let's try that. And that is already starting to look good. However, there are some things that are not really good. And the first of all is that these columns are very, very wide, right? So they are this wide because we simply created a grid with 2 columns here. However, we do not want these elements here to fill the entire column, basically. And that is, of course, possible. We can simply make them a little bit less wide. So right now, these elements, they occupy the entire grid cell because they are block level elements, and so they will expand to 100% of width of the available space, right? And we can, of course, easily see that here. So between these dashed lines here, as you know, we have the grid cells. So one grid cell and one grid cell. And so each of these elements is occupying by default that entire cell. But let's change that by making them a little bit less wide. So for example, just 75% of the available width. And so that's how it looks like then. So that looks a little bit nicer, right? However, of course, this one should now still move here so that then the entire thing is basically centered, and so that we don't have this huge spacing between the two. So we still want this exact same gap. And so what we want to do is to place this item here on the right side. So basically we want to align a grid item inside of a grid cell. And the way we do that is by using the justify items property, right? So I know that is way back. We learned that many hours ago, but now it is important again. So let's try that right here. So with align, or actually justify, because align is vertically and justify is horizontally, right? And so here this is clearly an issue of horizontal alignment. And so if we set justify items and set it to end, then both of them would move to the right side, right? And so this is what we want for the first one, but not for the second one. And so instead of using justify items on the grid container, we can simply do it for one grid element itself. So for one grid item, we can add justify self and then set that to end. Okay, so again, we learned all that a little bit back, but if you don't remember that, that is not a big problem. Okay, so let's add another class here. So just to select this one, and also want to then select the other one, which we will also need later. So I'm using dash dash for a variation again. So this one is the starter. So let's copy that here. And so as I just demonstrated in the DevTools, here we want justify self, right? And then push it all the way to the end. And so in the end, we end up with this. And so this looks a lot better than what we had before. The columns are now at a nice width, so they look quite natural this way. And yeah, they're still centered. And you see that this one here is aligned to the right side, and the first one is by default aligned to the left side. Right? So very nice, very beautiful. Now we just have this problem that here, this content broke into 2 lines, but we can fix that by making this text, I think, a little bit shorter. Right. So that's one of the problems. Let's fix that one first. So order times are between 11 and 9. So this we can abbreviate to order from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. So that's the same but shorter, and so that looks a lot nicer. But now another problem is that here, this and this one, they're not really aligned, right? So that looks quite off. And so one solution would be to somehow push this one here to the end. But another solution that I also like is to basically add another bullet point here and then add nothing. So saying that this one here is missing one of the features that this one has. So if you see, this one is quite similar to this one to this one, and these two are actually the same. But then this one gets access to the latest recipes, while this one does not. And so let's add another bullet point here and actually using another icon. So instead of a check mark, we can like use a cross or something. Well, not that. Yeah, this one here. So let's copy that. And then going back here, yeah, it's this one. So let's duplicate this and change the icon. And then we don't need any text at all. So you will see that it now looks quite nice, simply showing basically that this one does not exist. Of course, we need to format it also the same way. So giving it the same class. And so now this is the effect that I was looking for. And so now it makes it that both of these pricing tables have exactly the same size. Nice. And now let's start a little bit about visual hierarchy here. So these two pricing tables, they now look exactly the same. But what we want our user to do is to basically select this one here on the right, right? Because, well, this one here makes the company more money. And so we can say that this one here is the best value because it actually is. And we can also like highlight this one here. And the way I'm going to do that is by de-emphasizing this one here on the left. So remember that that is one of the techniques that we can use for creating a visual hierarchy between like these bigger components. And so that's what I'm going to do now. So only this one will have this background color, and here I will remove it. So let's add a similar class name to the second one. So pricing plan complete. And then I will add that background color only to this one. Okay. So this actually already creates a nice effect, right? We can immediately see that somehow this is more important. So this draws a lot more attention. However, like this, I think that this one here feels kind of lost, right? So to fix that, we can just give it a small border just so that it doesn't look completely detached from this one, because it's kind of lacking a structure right now. So if we give it back some border, then that should fix it. So let's add a border of 2 pixels, solid, and with the exact same color. So just ever so subtle, just so we can see that it is a bit distinguished from the rest of the background. Okay. So that looks way better. There is just one very small problem of alignment that we created by adding these 2 pixels here as a border. So let me show you by scrolling down here, and then as these 2 buttons here approach the end of the screen, watch how this one here is a little bit higher up than this one. And so the reason for that is these 2 pixels that we added basically on top of the already existing padding. All right. So remember from the box model how these basically add up together. And so we need to remove these 2 pixels. So for this one. So actually this padding will only apply to the complete pricing. And then this one here, to compensate, will have a little bit less. So 4.6 RAM. So this is just a minor issue, but now it is fixed. And so it's perfect now. Let's also emphasize a little bit here some of these numbers. So just again to make this one here a bit more prominent. So in the second one, yeah, let's use our strong element. So 2 meals per day. Let's actually include the meals here. And then here order 24/7. All right. And so with this, we are almost finished here. And we could leave it like this, but I want to add something more, which is basically like a ribbon here saying that this one is the best value. And so this is going to be similar to something that we already did before a couple of times. So again, basically we will add like an element here, which will go like this, and then it should say best value. So how do you think we could do that? Well, one great way would be to use a before or an after pseudo element. All right. So on this one. So let's copy that. And well, I didn't want this one. All right. And then here the content should be best value. And so that should then immediately place it somewhere here. Yeah, so here it is. So nice, but let's now format it and place it in this corner. So for that, we're going to use absolute positioning. Absolute. And so for that, of course, the parent element inside of which it should be placed, we need to make it a relative positioned element. So this one here, let's make the text uppercase. So text transform uppercase. Let's increase the font size here, 1.4 RAM maybe. And let's make it bold as well. And like really bold this time. Oh, and of course we still need to position it here. And let's just start with top 0 and right 0. All right. And let's give it some background color as well. And we could, of course, use the orange color that we have been using, but let's actually go for this yellow here. So this is one that we used for the tags previously. So let's reuse that same color here. All right, and there it is already. So already nicely positioned. Let's maybe give it some padding, and then we can position it exactly where we want it. So padding, maybe 8 pixels at the top to make it not too big. And then on the sides, it doesn't really matter for now. Let's just use 3.2 RAM right here. And the text, I think, could be also a bit darker. So the contrast didn't look so nice there on the yellow. Yeah, that's better. All right. So remember I said that I want it kind of to be like this. So we want to rotate it a little bit. And so for that, we can use, again, transform. And now, indeed, we will use the rotate that I had shown you before. So 45 degrees. And so that is already looking like something. But now to position it exactly where we want it to be, we need to play around like with the top and right values until we find the right position. So let's open up this one here and find the pseudo element here in the HTML. And then let's play around, as I said, a little bit with these numbers. So let's say maybe we start at 5%. So we want to make these here actually also basically flexible, so that when something changes here, then the position here stays also at the same place. And I'm using percentages here because that's just usually the best choice when we're building a flexible layout. So on the right, let's also like say 5%, or actually that must be minus, and that's not really enough. So let's go a bit down. Okay, let's maybe give it some more space here, actually like this, or maybe like this, yeah. And then we need to just position it nicely. And yeah, I think like this, it looks okay, right? Now, what we need to do next is, of course, basically cut off these corners here. So these we do not want, right? So, do you remember how we can do that? Well, we can simply use overflow hidden. Well, actually not on this one. So the overflow hidden needs to be always on the parent element. So basically the one on which this one here is overflowing. So this parent element here, this one will want to hide the content that is overflowing it. Okay, so let's add that there, and let's also memorize these values here. So 6 and minus 7. So 6 here and minus 7%, of course. Okay, and now, as I was saying, it is this parent element here which needs the overflow hidden. Okay, and nice. But still not perfect, because here, of course, we want this to go all the way out. So we don't want to see any corners there. So we need to increase the padding here a bit, let's say 4. And so that makes it then bigger, but it also makes it so that, that it changed kind of here the position again. So let's just add something big here, like 8 rem, just to make sure that that doesn't happen. So let's play around with this a little bit here. And that is starting to look good. But to see it better, we need to turn off this one, right? So this is basically a lot of just playing around until we find the right value here. And yeah, this might be it actually. I think this looks now as if it was centered. And so let's leave it like this. So you see that here we cannot use like a nice flex box or something like this to make it really centered. So this is just playing around until we find the right spot. So minus 18 here. And then down here the padding is 8. So minus 18 and 8 rem here. So now that should be fixed, and that does look very beautiful. So this definitely gives it another really nice visual effect right here. Okay, so this part here, I now consider it finished. And so let's actually very quickly just get started on the next part, which is the features part, just so I can show you something else. So right here after this first grid right here, so we have this grid here, so container grid with 2 columns, but now we want another grid right after it, right? And that's no problem at all. We can simply create another similar thing to this. So right here, so div container, and it's a grid. And here, let's see how many features we have, but it should be 4. So yeah, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so let's just add 4 div elements here really fast called feature, and then just duplicating them. And so here we want the one with 4 columns. And this one I think we already have. Yeah, here it is. So 4 equally sized columns. Okay, but now here's what I actually want to show you, which is the fact that there is now, of course, no spacing between these grids here. So this is the first time this is happening where we have multiple grids inside of the same section. But that is, of course, perfectly acceptable. So absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it should actually be really common. And so we need a way of working with that situation automatically. So we do not want to manually have to add now some margin bottom to this first grid. So instead, we basically want that to happen automatically. So what we can do here is to basically add a margin bottom to this grid right here. So let's use once again our 9.6 rem here, which is kind of a standard that we have been using for vertical spacing. So let's check that out. And indeed, now here we have that space that we need. However, if we move up here, you will see that space being added everywhere. Well, here that's actually not the case, but here we set it manually, I remember. And so that's why it's not here. But in this one, it should now be there. So this grid now has, of course, that margin and then plus all this additional padding. So here we have way too much space because this one, we actually do not want this margin bottom, right? Because indeed, there is only one grid here. And so it doesn't make sense that this one has a margin bottom as well. So that is actually quite simple to fix, because we can simply say that when a grid is the last child, then the margin bottom should be 0. And so, well, let's fire up our inspector here again. And so indeed, now the margin here is gone, right? It has a margin bottom of 0, while this one here at the bottom, it still maintains the one that we want. So in the pricing section, now this grid does have the 9.6 rem, and this one does not. Okay, so this is a new and important addition to our grid, because this will allow us to basically have multiple grids inside of the same section. Okay, now we can just make this even a little bit nicer and using a trick that I haven't shown you before. So let me show it to you now. So there is another pseudo-class that we can use, which is the not. So here, what we're going to say is a grid that is not the last child will have this margin, and that's it. So we can remove it from here, and we can remove all this, and have it all in just this one line of code. So this probably looks a bit confusing, so let's analyze what we just did here. So before, basically by default, we were always adding this margin here on all the grid elements. And then after that, we selected the ones that were the last and removed it. So first we put it everywhere, and then we removed it on some of them, right? But now we are doing it the other way around. Now we will only add it if it is not the last child. Okay, so that is different, right? We will not simply add it always by default. Instead, we will only add this margin to the bottom if, again, the grid element is not the last child inside of its parent container. Okay, so I think this makes sense, and this code is a little bit nicer than this one. All right. And if you want to practice using this kind of code here, then you can go back to many, many examples where we did this, so without using the not. And so all there, you can replace what we did here using the not pseudo class with last child. Okay, so that would be good for you to practice, I think. And so with that, we can now build this feature section or this feature part here right in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to finish building the pricing section by now finally building that final features part. And remember how at the end of the last lecture, we already created a new container here with a new grid with 4 columns. So here we already have the boxes for each of the 4 features, and so let's now fill them up. So these are our 4 features. Let me just copy the first one. Okay. And I'm going to paste that right here. So as we saw before a couple of times, a feature block usually has first an icon, then some kind of small headline, and then below that some smaller text for a description. So we will have an icon, so I will get that next. But for now, let's start here with the feature title. So that's what I'm going to call it. And here again, we're not using any H element, so no H4 or H5, because this is not really a heading of a new section. All right. So here we have never cook again. And then below that, let's simply add the feature text. So just moving that up here. And there we go. Now we just need the icon here. So I already pre-selected the icons here, of course, so we don't have to lose a lot of time searching for them. But here you could, of course, now go through them and basically find the one that you think fits the best for this feature. So for this entire text. Now the one that I chose is the infinite icon. So if you never have to cook again, then basically you have food forever. So I liked this one here really a lot. And so this one, I'm going to call it the feature icon as expected. So let's just quickly check that out here. And indeed, there we go. So icon, then that text, and then the description below. And so let's now duplicate this a couple of times. Or actually, yeah, let's do that. So duplicating it 3 times and then just deleting this one. Okay, triple clicking here. So this is the second one. So local and organic is the second feature. Then we also have no waste, just to show consumers that we are very concerned with the environment, not waster. And finally this one. And then after that, we of course have to go looking for the icons. So pause anytime. All right, and let's start with this one, pause. And that is actually a pretty common icon, just like you might find, for example, on your remote for your TV. So, well, actually, let's not paste it here, because then we override our class. So I will just basically remember here. So it's called pause outline. So I just need to replace the infinite here. Next up, we have no waste. So this one is all about the environment. And so I figured that this icon here with the leaf would be very nice to symbolize that. So we could also have used like a globe or an earth, but this one is also nice. So leaf outline, yeah, right here. And then finally, this one is for local and organic. So here I'm using this one, nutrition. So this looks, well, it doesn't look really organic, but I think the user can get the point by seeing this icon. So nutrition. And okay. So I said back then in the icon section that we should always use icons that are really crystal clear, right? But of course, that is not always really 100% possible. And especially if we use a free icon pack such as this one. But usually with some searching and some creativity, we can still find something that fits our message quite well. And so, yeah, here they are, all the 4 icons. And so now it's time to simply style this. So, I'm in the wrong file. All right, here we go. So it is the feature icon, the feature title, and the feature text. Once again, using the Alt or Option click at the same time. And there we go. So let's start with the text here. That's always a little bit easier. So the font size here, I'm not really sure. Let's see what we have been using for our tertiary heading. So that is like 3 rem. And so I think that this one can be then 1 level below. So 1 step below in our system, which should be, yeah, 2.4. So let's use that. And let's also make it darker, basically, and make it bold. So really bold this one, because since it is smaller, the boldness can be a little bit more. And also some margin to the bottom here, 1.6 rem. Okay, then our feature text. And here, as always, I'm using 1.8 rem for font size and line height. Okay, and let's just also already give this one here a nice color. And here I'm going to use our brand color. So this one, and let's give it some height also here already. Let's just start with 4.2 rem maybe. And the same for the width and some margin to the bottom. And so here, for the visual hierarchy, the title and the text should be closer together than the title and the icon. So here we have 1.6, and so let's double that here. So 3.2 rem. Okay. Nice. That's already looking really good. But now remember how we actually want to enclose these icons into a circle. So a circle with a nice background color, but very subtle and very light. So we can actually use the same as this one, right? So to also keep it consistent. But even like this, it's already looking nice. And I think there's also some nice visual balance with this first content that we have here. But that will become even better once we do create these circles here. So let me show you how we can do that. And actually, there's no need to create yet another element. So there's no need to create a container element for each of these icons. Instead, we can style them directly. And let me show you. And first, I will make them a little bit bigger. 3.2. And then let me immediately give them some background. So that is this one here, remember? And yeah, let's check it out. And there we go. So that's looking good.